Hi.
Welcome, welcome, Mr. Thomas on Mental Health 101. And can you please introduce more about yourself that I miss?
Absolutely. So I am Thomas R. Wilson. I am a storyteller, writer, advocate, business owner, um, mental health coach. The list goes on and on and on. But my focus is on storytelling and creativity and how it can help bridge gaps, build communities, and establish a better world for those around us through compassionate and empathetic care for all.
Care for all. We love that, Mr. Thomas. And thank you so much for being part to all my podcast. Mr. Thomas is my avid guest. And today, let's talk about mental health awareness for men, especially for men people. So, Mr. Thomas, if a traditional idea of, well, mental awareness for men, what it's all about?
Definitely. So I think it's important to note, especially in today's day and age, that mental health care for men is rapidly evolving,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also becoming a very hot button topic. I think a lot of us men in this world we struggle. We feel more alone. We feel more afraid. We feel more isolated. But there's also a growing resentment, I think, towards masculinity. And I'm not here to say masculinity is bad. I'm here to say toxic masculinity is bad. And I
True.
think, especially in a world where there is so much frustration towards that, a lot of men don't know what to do or how to seek care or how to better live their life. And I think it's important to note to always start the conversation that men are not inherently wrong. We're not um we're not the product that we're told, but there is a societal bias that tells men to chase some very toxic mindsets. And so I think when we first have this conversation, it's important to note that the idea of toxic masculinity, I think, should be separated from masculinity because I think masculinity can be a caregiver, it can be compassion, it can be kindness, it can be responsibility, and it can also be a gentleness. And I think, especially after all of these years where men have been told um, that they're less than for chasing old fashioned stereotypes. There's a lot of confusion on how to better live our lives. And I think those core concepts of one, the bias, but also one, the idea that masculinity can be a healthy platform are key to remember. And I think when we're talking about men's mental health, I think that's a very powerful place to start, is talking about the gentility and the kindness and the love that masculinity can carry.
Very well said, Mr. Thomas. Let's talk about the language of survival. If I am fine is the default male response, what alternative phrases or questions can men learn that might open the door to authentic conversation without feeling they are complaining or being weak?
I love that question. Yeah, I think it's important to note that especially American society does not really teach young men how to communicate their emotions well. And I think that's where we have to start. We have to start with young individuals, young men, young kids, because communication is key, as you said. And so often we're told to just say, I'm fine. And I hold the belief that quiet misery is actually never quiet. It's often some of the loudest things in this world. And so I think when we're talking to people and we're having conversations around men and their mental health, and I think you nailed it, often people are told they're complaining or they're being weak. I think we have to reframe the conversation. I think it goes back to the idea that, if men complain, they're being toxic, or if men are sharing their mental health journey, it is a sign of weakness. And I think what I love about the world today is we're starting to acknowledge that there are things like therapy, which are very valid. There are things like mutual partnerships and relationships that are growing, and we can take some of the responsibility for men always being the caretaker. But I think we as a society really need to acknowledge, and I think this is for men of any skill level or success level, we need to acknowledge men are valid for sharing their pain and their struggles. We're not valid for yelling it or screaming it or burying it into somebody else, but we are valid for sharing that. And I think the first step is applying more empathy to these conversations. It's also helping men understand where to find safe conversations. And I think it's also going back to toxic masculinity, challenging the idea that, men who share their emotions are soft or they're weak. And I think the first step in that is helping men connect with reliable relationships, sustainable relationships that encourage, foster, and support healthy communication, because communication is key to life, and communicating our pain is key to our survival as human beings.
Indeed, Mr. Thomas. So let's talk about the purpose paradox. Traditional masculine identity has been heavily tied to being a provider. As the role evolve, what new healthy sources of meaning identity can make cultivate to prevent the purpose vacuum for being a mental health crisis?
So, my goodness, all kinds of fantastic questions today. And yeah, I think there is I love that idea of the caretaker vacuum. I think it's okay for men to not be the caretaker all the time. In fact, as someone who likes to view himself as a feminist, I think it's completely fine for men to step back. And like you said, so often men are the caretaker, they're the rock, they're all of these things that have been applied to masculinity over the years. But I think as our society is evolving, it's important to note that in relationships, they thrive best when it's a mutual partnership, when both sides can work together and work alongside and collaborate to be the caretaker or the caregiver. But I think it's also important to note that that can play into friendships, but it can also play into the bias and the fear men have of what happens when I'm not the caregiver, when I'm not that. And I think it's important to note, one of my favorite things that I've seen is more and more men are staying at home and they're finding alternative routes to being having the job, being the breadwinner, all of that. And I think the other thing in that is so beautiful is I think as men, we're also acknowledging that we all have our strengths, we all have our weaknesses, and collectively as a society, I think it's okay to be. I am not the person who is going to be at the job 9 to 5. I think it's okay to acknowledge that you might need your partner's support for a period of time. But I think it's also really cool that we're moving into a world where men are also identifying that there is value and there's purpose in being an alternative caregiver. Like being the emotional support of your wife when they are sad and having that reciprocated, but also being the dad or the figure that is supporting wellness and care for different community models. traditional masculinity is, I think, so important to note here because it's so rooted in the idea that there is one role to serve, there is one idea of what we can be. And whether or not it's friendships or a relationship with a therapist or even just a relationship with children, it's so important to break that mold because only having one pathway really limits us and I think has led us to a society where men feel pigeonholed and they feel restricted. And the beautiful thing about so many men nowadays is we are, like I said this already, but we are identifying different pathways. And I think that is one of the healthiest things that we can do.
We well said, Mr. Thomas. So many men learn to express psychological distress through physical symptoms, anger, or silence. What are the subtle, often missed signals that someone might be struggling behind the functional facade?
So I think the big one, and this goes back to that quiet misery comment I made. It's so the reason part of the reason I say quiet misery is often the loudest thing that we can express is rooted in exactly that. Men often, I like to say, we often bend until we break. And so we might be quiet and we might start saying those words of I'm fine more often. Or kind of what so many men have also been taught to do is bury ourselves in work, bury ourselves within more and more work, make more and more money, and then come home and silently sit in a room by ourselves. And I think the big mental health signs are retreating inwards, especially since so many men have been told not to express their emotions. So, what I have observed is more silence in communication. I have seen more men kind of try to stoically hide their expression on their face. They may not play with their kids as much. They may not talk about work and its impact. Some men, unfortunately, may seek, alcohol or smoking more. And I think the even bigger signs are when there's a disconnect from the people in their lives, when someone who is normally happy and giddy start to become angrier and more aggressive, or someone who is experiencing anxiety might purposely seek out solitary activities. And even someone who is depressed might start to talk more um, pessimistically, more about the end of their life, more about the worries that they have, or they might shift to a deficit based mindset and accidentally start nitpicking others or deliberately deriving themselves, making themselves less than, and kind of those things. And I think for a lot of us, it's important to note all of these things are going to be different, especially based on who that person is in your life and what those changes are. And unfortunately, when it gets worse, those symptoms are going to intensify. And you may even see a lack of willingness, like not shaving as much, not taking care of hair, not dressing as clean. Um, and these are all signs that we need to honor and care for the people in our lives. But I think, especially for men, we get to a point where it gets so severe that something drastic needs to be done. And the other last thing I will say, and I touched on this really briefly, but silence. We as men are taught to really retreat inwards in our communication. And especially if you have a healthy, loving relationship, I think that's one of the biggest things, just continual silence. Because unfortunately, silence is often an indicator of great misery. It may not always be, but it can be.
Can be for sure. So, Mr. Thomas, women often bear the emotional labor of interpreting men's distress. How can we better equip partners, friends, and family to read between the lines without making them therapies? And how can men become better translators of their own internal states?
Love that question. So to answer the first one, and this will play into the second, I highly encourage, especially for men who have women in their lives or other partners. Um, I want to highlight, and this may seem kind of ridiculous at first, but I recommend creating an emotional blueprint, something where whoever your partner is, you can start to establish kind of a wellness plan. It's something that is utilized in a lot of therapy and a lot of programs, but it also holds a lot of value in relationships. You can have active conversations, especially if someone is struggling with depression or anxiety or any other mental health struggle. You can help people by communicating and establishing a plan of this is when I'm upset. This is how I need you to respond. This is how, if I'm depressed, these are my symptoms. What can we do to adjust this? And I know in relationships, especially romantic relationships, and it's important that partners are not the therapist. They're not, even in friendships, it's important people are not therapy friends. But having a blueprint, an idea of even just this is who I am when I'm sad, what can I do to adjust and break free from this? And having those conversations is incredibly valid. And I actually encourage working with a therapist if you do that. I mention therapy a lot because I'm a big believer that everybody can benefit from therapy. But the other side of that, and I want to emphasize, it is so important to not draw and start thinking of your partner as a therapist. Um, and additionally, I think it's very important for men overall to acknowledge that having external professional relationships where, and I say relationship because it is a relationship with a therapist, not a romantic one or a friendship. It is a working relationship. I think that's key. And I also think it's completely fine to have a therapist when you feel well, because there's so much internalized in us, and especially as men, that we can't say to other people. And having a therapist is a confidant, it is a healer, and that person can also help support you, especially if you're not comfortable with sharing those emotions with other people. One of the things that I want to add to this, though, as especially as men, when it comes to communication, I think we need to acknowledge it's okay to to break up into boxes what we share with and who we share it with. Um, there's a lot of conversation about oversharing with friends now or over relying on friends, and so I encourage having a treatment plan, a breakdown of who you can rely on, when, and how. I say this all the time, but when you have a mental health need, every day has to be a commitment to your best self. And if you don't do that, you can slip up, even if it's just one day. The other thing when it comes to communication, I want to emphasize really quickly is it's okay to share. I know it goes against a ton of human existence to go against that, but communicating and starting to communicate is vital and it's important. And I think when we break these norms, it starts with having someone we can trust. It starts with someone who is going to keep information private, even if it's a friend for a moment, unless, a partner needs to know. But it also relies on boundaries and a clear understanding of how you communicate. And the last thing I will say is honor how you communicate. Yes, you can grow, you can develop, you can blossom, but at the same time, it's important people understand and value how you communicate so you can get better at communication and, and then start to grow within your care network.
Very well said, Mr. Thomas. Yes, people, it's okay not to be okay, and communicate with your partners or your loved ones, your friends, and tell them what is inside. Beyond just naming toxic traits, Mr. Thomas, what are the active positive skills like emotional granularity or boundary setting or vulnerable communication that should in every modern man's toolkit, and how they practice?
So I think the first thing, definitely aside from any toxic traits, would be empathy. And I'm not just talking about empathy for other people or empathy for your coworkers. I'm talking about empathy for ourselves. As was so expertly said, it's okay to not be okay. A bit of an oxymoron is key because so often men are told to look through the lens of other people, but respecting ourselves, respecting our identities, respecting who we are, understanding that we are not perfect is so crucial in life. The other things I'm going to emphasize are respect and kindness. Respect is key. It's not just key for ourselves. We have to respect ourselves, but carrying ourselves with respect for the people around us and being an example of that respectfulness is huge. But kindness is a rarity in this world more than it should be. And I think for men, especially healthy men, demonstrating and showcasing kindness is crucial. And I think that leads into another thing, which is men are often looked to be as leaders as I'm trying to think of the other word, as leaders, as examples of maturity and dignity. And I think that leads into also we have to know how to be tough in a gentle and respectful way. A lot of people, I think, confuse being brash with being direct. And there is ways to be direct in a kind, loving way and still establish what we need people to do. And I could go on this, but I'll try to get highlight two more. And I think one of them is, and this is crucial, is all of these skills need to be applied to our partners, to our friends, our allies, to those fighting for us. Um, because especially speaking as someone who grew up around some very toxic male influences, it's okay to acknowledge that our partners, our friends hold value, and we are not the central leaders of the family. We are meant to be providers. We are also meant to be collaborators. We are meant to be partners. We are meant to be allies. And in that, even in our friendships, even in our familial relationships, carrying all these things can also help us develop our own mental health by acknowledging the value of them and also acknowledging that as our own role, as our own people, there is nothing so good for our mental health as being respectful to ourselves and others in the same way. And so the last thing I will say in this, and I think this is a crucial skill, is also learning how to communicate. It's a practice, it's a daily routine, it's a lifelong skill, but carrying ourselves in a clear, compassionate, and useful communication method is going to encourage our own wellness, but it's going to encourage the wellness of everyone around us, which is going to counteract a lot of that pain that can exist.
Very well said, Mr. Thomas. But before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, people, because my abstract essay is already in sixth season, abstract poetry in third season, and my Pook 101 review in sixth season as well, comedy 101 third season, and food 101 in sixth season too, geography 101, love letters, movie 101 review, music 101, our fifth season, science 101, sex 101 fourth season, Spiritual Awakening 101, Trivia 101, Law 101, Mental Health 101, Motivation 101, Entrepreneurship 101, and of course, my Bible Verses 101 on my baby podcast. So please listen to them wherever you listen your podcast. So, Mr. Thomas, let's talk about the North Star. If we get this right, what is the tangible sign we've seen in a generation? Is statistic like lowered suicide rates or something more cultural or like a different way we see fathers interacting with their children in public spaces?
So I think the North Star that I've seen, and I think this is shifting. The thing that I've seen is more and more people acknowledging empathy and masculinity is a way for men to shine. And I've seen this happen. I've seen men apply this with their kids, whether or not they have autism. I've seen men apply this in their relationships. And I say this is key. I'm a huge advocate for empathy because I believe men who apply empathy and love and care for the people in their lives genuinely, lovingly, who are gentle when they need to be, who can be compassionately strong, that is a sign not just of mental health wellness, it's not just a sign of strength, but it's a sign that we as men are acknowledging that there can be more strength, more resilience, and kind, compassionate actions than there ever can be in hostility and anger. And I view that as a North Star because it gives me so much hope for the future of men. And I also view it as hope for the identity that masculinity in its core is that kindness. It is the caretaking and the love for the people around us. And because of that, I truly believe that the future of men and the future of our mental health is in a very positive state right now.
Well, Mr. Thomas R. Wilson, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. So, can you please invite our listeners to support your business, your advocacy, or whatever project that you're doing right now?
Absolutely. So you can find me on LinkedIn at Thomas R. Wilson. You can find my email, which I always tell people I didn't realize how many of these letters sound the same until I said it out loud. But my email is ndttrpg at gmail.com. You also make sure my website is listed and my link tree is present. But I also encourage you, if you have questions or want to have more of a conversation on this, or even just want to break into the idea of how to be more compassionate, I'm happy to do that. And I also do community events all across Colorado and online, even globally at this point. With that, though, I always encourage reach out to me, contact me, and let's continue to have conversations.
Definitely. Please do connect with Mr. Thomas, and for sure, you will be empowered with his knowledge and wisdom. And Mr. Thomas, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
More time, people. See you soon.